Hello, everybody. Welcome to Living One. My name is Olivia, and I'm so glad to welcome all of you today for our fourth gathering of Living One's third season of 2025, A Re-Enchanted World. This is the culmination of this year's Living One theme, Seeing the Unseen, Restoration through Re-Enchantment. For those of you who don't already know, Living One is the Krulos Center for Nonviolence's webinar series, now in its sixth year. The Krulos Center for Nonviolence is a nonprofit dedicated to generating deep commitment and connection with the world and within ourselves, dissolving divides between human, plant, and animal, mind and body, science and spirit, and self and nature. Through teachings, practice, and community, Krulos catalyzes a shift in how we live, relate, and belong, because healing begins when we realize that we were never apart. Our third and final Living One series of 2025, A Re-Enchanted World, continues to explore the unseen, those parts of nature and ourselves obliterated and reduced by commodification. The mercantile, capitalist, realist Cartesian paradigm has supported scientific, technological, and industrial advances, but stripped our psyches and imaginations, even our very perceptions and understanding of the richly entangled, convivially connected nature of life on our living planet. Living One invites creative and committed people from around the world to discuss how to change our lives to serve Earth and all of our plant and animal kin. Become part of Earth revitalization by listening and learning with these amazing speakers. Our guest today, our returning guest, is Erik Jampa Andersson. Erik is an environmental historian, teacher, and the author of Unseen Beings, How We Forgot the World is More Than Human. With a 20-year background in Tibetan studies, his current research focuses on animistic philosophies and the critical intersection of ecology, spirituality, and health in a more than human world. His research also extends into the field of Tolkien studies, which he joined us to discuss back in March. If you haven't already, you can visit our website or YouTube to watch Erik's first appearance on Living One. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various Indigenous lands. I am currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. This land exists also as a place of trade with other Indigenous communities, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki. The Krulos Center for Nonviolence, located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, Takelma, Daku Betete, coyote, coho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Finally, we ask that all of us participate today with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. So without further ado, we welcome Erik and Izzy.
Hello, thank you ever so much, Olivia, and hello again, Erik. And I'm afraid there are two cats who aren't actually taking part in a spirit of peace and wisdom. They're fighting each other against the oak door behind me, so I hope that they don't disturb matters too much. But Erik, it is an absolute delight to have you back, and I missed you last time you were on. I had to work, so it's my first opportunity to be able to speak to you in person, and I'm delighted by that. And I thought we might start out with what your understanding or definition of enchantment is.
Hell of a question. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me, and it's great to be here. Glad that we could be here together, Izzy, as well. It's really nice. Also, hello to Patrick Curry, who's here, which is incredible. Dear friend of mine and endless source of inspiration. Unfortunately, I had to miss Patrick's talk last week. I've been waiting for it to come on YouTube because I was at Oxenmoot, the yearly conference for the Tolkien Society, where I was delivering a paper. But it's really great to have you here today. And I will be mentioning you a lot today. So thank you for being here. Yeah, as for defining enchantment, it's a bit tricky, since it is indeed one of the traits of enchantment that it cannot simply be sort of caught in a net of words. As is said, I think most dictionaries associate it rather perplexingly with an experience of extreme pleasure, which I think misses the mark quite significantly. Otherwise, you get associations that tie it in with magic and spellcraft and those sorts of things, which is perhaps a little bit closer, but it's a peculiar kind of magic. It's not the magic of a sleight of hand magician, nor is it the sort of assertion of will. You know, magic is an attempt to sort of impose your will upon the outside world. It's a much more natural and sort of ordinary magic. Uh, I I suppose the easiest approach to defining it is as an experience of wonder, of awe, which usually arises out of a particular set of experiences, usually through some kind of relational connection. It can also arise through spiritual experiences of awe and sort of transcendent awe that can be adjacent, at least, to the experience of enchantment. Very frequently with experiences or encounters with the so-called natural world, or certainly engagements with particularly moving forms of art. These are some of the, I think, more common sorts of pathways that can bring us into that experience of enchantment. Literally, etymologically, it comes from Latin incantare, which means to be caught in a song. So cantare literally is, in Italian cantare or in French enchantement. So it's literally to be brought into a song, which is caught very beautifully in The Lord of the Rings. I will be talking about Tolkien a lot today as well. This is unavoidable. This is what happens. But there's a great moment when the Fellowship is in Lothlorien, and Sam makes the comment. Actually, wrote it down here. He says, "It's sunlight and bright day, right enough. I thought that elves were all for moon and stars, but this is more elvish than anything I ever heard tell of. I feel as if I was inside a song, if you take my meaning." Which Tolkien, being himself a philologist and being very well acquainted with the etymology of enchantment, he is very much having Sam say that he feels enchanted. So it is a fundamentally immersive kind of experience, which can be, certainly it can arise out of an experience of the natural world. But as Patrick Curry makes very clear in his wonderful book, Art and Enchantment, which everyone should read, he talks, very clearly about the fact that this is a fundamentally relational experience. He says, quote, "It is wonder at or enchantment by another. It's not power over them, nor being the object of power. And although the extent of reciprocity varies with the degree of intensity, as with any true relationship, it is two-way. Apprehending the enchanting other, one is apprehended by them. It also follows that because no one is in charge, enchantment is wild, unbiddable. That inconvenient truth means that although it can be invited, it cannot be created, commanded, or managed." Apologies for extensively quoting someone who is in the room, but it's incredibly fitting. Enchantment should be understood as a relational experience. I describe it sometimes as a meeting of minds. It's that moment when you sort of break through and have an authentic experience of witnessing an other, of actually acknowledging their otherness and their personhood. And it's the sort of magical spark that arises out of that. There is another great moment in Lothlorien when Frodo touches a tree, and he says that, or Tolkien says of Frodo that he had never before been so suddenly and keenly aware of the feel and texture of the tree's skin and the life within it. He says he felt a delight in wood and the touch of it, neither as forester nor as carpenter. It was the delight of the living tree itself. So it's that moment that can be so basic in any other context that for whatever reason, because you happen to be sort of open to the possibility, there's a breaking through, there's a real encounter, there's a meeting of minds. So that's how I would, in a very roundabout way, define enchantment.
That's wonderful. And I was thinking as you were saying that, particularly going through the etymology, which Patrick spoke to as well last week. But it struck me this time, I wrote a paper that I presented to a conference in Vienna, which was about subsong with a robin. So the robin was subsinging, which is, for those of you who don't know, when they sing with their beak shut, and it's like playtime, practice time for the birds, and they can be a lot more experimental in those periods. But he would be very close to me, like the distance I am away from this screen, and he would look me in the eye, sort of side to side as birds do. Yeah, I'm so tuneful, and this was absolutely enchanting. Anyway, I was writing the paper and I hadn't read Patrick's book, and I wrote enchanting, and then I thought, I've done Latin, I've done French, I know. So I wrote about, the etymology of it, and I was also referring to Stimmung, the term of attunement from phenomenology, also which I didn't really know about. And so I had all these things, which subsequently, given another year and a half of reading the work of people who've actually studied this stuff, it had appeared as a in the moment. This knowledge of the subject had kind of been embodied in the moment with the robin, and it is quite profound how much happens to you, how much it shapes you in those moments of genuine relational enchantment. They are life-changing in this sort of incredible way, and even and it's something so small, it really.
Yeah,
But
oh, go
sorry,
ahead.
yeah, please respond.
No, I was just going to say that is a sort of quality of it is that it's often very ordinary kinds of experiences that, 99% of the time you would just go through it and not think twice about it. Even relationships, I'm struck by the fact, given the, sort of group here especially, there's so many times when I talk to people and they'll say, there was one day when I looked at my dog or looked at my cat and, they had been with them their entire lives. They had known them very well, looked at them a million times. And then one day, for some reason, they look at them and it just sort of dawns on them that they're a person, that they're aware, that they are looking back at them. And very frequently, that ends up being a trigger point for a lot of folks that end up, becoming vegan, is they
Mm.
have that experience and then they have the further recognition that, oh, but it's also not just my dog. And then they start to notice that in other animals as well. And then that's the sort of moment that they decide, oh, I can't actually contribute to their exploitation anymore. And it's one of those things, they might have had dogs their entire lives. They might have had dogs since they were children and never thought twice about it, even having loving, engaged relationships with them. But then for some reason, sometimes you can have this real, genuine experience of enchantment that completely upends everything that you thought you knew.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, il a bouleversé ma vie, as you might say if you were French. Anyway, I don't know where that came from. It's thinking about enchanté. Um, I wanted to, this leads us nicely into considering why enchantment matters, because, I talked about the life-changing of it, but not necessarily in a moral or ethical way. Whereas you've brought up an example where there is this changing a way of being. And how often do you think the process of enchantment can enrich your life morally as well as in some kind of sense of feeling?
I think it certainly has that capacity. Um, I think that it depends on a lot of factors, including the explanatory frameworks that we impose on top of it. That's one of the risks with enchantment, especially when it exists in certain kinds of contexts. I think particularly religious and spiritual contexts. You can have these marvelous, sort of mystical experiences of awe, but then if that's being had in an environment where there's a pre-existing explanatory framework that's then placed on top of it to sort of explain it away, that ends up minimizing its capacity to really be life-changing in a more organic way. It could
Mm.
potentially be quite life-changing in a more, sort of institutionalized way, which could be positive or negative depending on your vantage point. But it certainly awakes something primal in us. It's a part of our sort of birthright as living beings in a living world to have this experience. It re-sparks an experience of animistic wonder at its core. I think that's a fundamental part of this, which makes it very relevant to conversations surrounding more than human ethics.
Yeah.
It allows us to have that deeply felt sort of awareness of the existence of other kinds of persons, human and non-human. And when you have that on not just an intellectual level, but on an existential level, on a sort of, dare I say, spiritual level, I think it has much more of a capacity to actually inform the decisions that we make and the ways that we live. An experience of enchantment can compel us to care. I think that is sort of in a nutshell why it matters. Whether this is interpersonal between humans. Certainly, you can have experiences of enchantment with a lover or with a child or with, another human being that you are relating to. And then you have that moment where you actually see that there's an entire universe of experience within them. And that can completely change your approach to that person and potentially to, human persons as a whole. But that can easily extend beyond the human. And that's, one of the great virtues of enchantment, of, literature and art that generally tends to really foster it, is it helps us break outside of those more conventional boundaries. And yeah, it compels us to care in a way that is very difficult to mimic other ways.
Yes, I think that makes complete sense to me. In our conversation last week, Patrick, who I will now be speaking of in his presence, mentioned that we needed to be cautious with the idea of re-enchantment because that seemed to suggest perhaps utilizing the idea of enchantment for a process of whatever our end might be, and that enchantment isn't such a thing as can be utilized in that fashion. So, I mean, we were trying to express sort of, well, disenchanting the world, if you like. So what I'm trying to get at from you is a sense of, do you feel that there has been a process of maybe not disenchanting the world as such, but about being closed off to the enchantment that is always potentially there within the relationships that one can have?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There's a few things with that. I find that to be a really exciting question for a few reasons. One, I there's a great book called The Myth of Disenchantment by Jason Josephson Storm,
Oh,
which is
okay.
quite good. He makes the argument essentially that we were never actually disenchanted, in the sort of, enlightened Western world. We have this myth of the Enlightenment as an era of sort of, systematic disenchantment of humanity. But in reality, on the one hand, we have Isaac Newton, discoverer of gravity. On the other hand, we have Isaac Newton, the alchemist. On one hand, we have Madame Curie, the great scientist and discoverer of incredible, medical breakthroughs. And on the other hand, we have Madame Curie doing seances to try to, contact her dead husband. In the sort of evolution of our scientific sort of quote unquote Western world, a lot of the figures that have been at the helm of that historically have also been incredibly interested in things that we would now consider to be in the realm of the superstitious or magical. So if there has been a genuine process of disenchantment, it's been much more recent than we like to think it has been. Not even approaching the topic of religiosity and, Christian religion in the West in the supposedly disenchanted age, nevertheless being deeply invested in magical ideas, not least of all being the existence of, Sky Daddy. But on the other hand, well, no, there is more to say on that also, to the extent that I think a lot of the impulse towards enchantment has not gone anywhere. That's certainly a primal urge that we have, but we have channeled it in different kinds of ways. I often talk about, for instance, in modern literature and films surrounding like extraterrestrials. Our stories that we tell about extraterrestrials are very much not precisely. I will go back on this a little later, but they are fairy stories for a technocratic, sort of age. They're the most disenchanted form that you can take, but it's a traveler's tale ultimately. It's, there is enchantment, but it's just over there and you can get to it through technology. It's not really changing our perspective on things. It's just locating it somewhere else because we think we've already conquered this world. So we have to place all the magic things on a different world. And then those magic things generally tend to be either very anthropomorphic and humanoid, or otherwise they're obsessed with humans and they either want to destroy us or they want to abduct us and take us apart and so on. It's an anthropocentric sort of fairy story for a modern, supposedly disenchanted world. But you'll find plenty of people that don't believe in anything, supernatural, but are absolutely convinced of, that UFOs in the sky are from extraterrestrial beings from a different planet. 200 years ago, someone would see, glowing lights in the sky, and they certainly wouldn't be UFOs from aliens. They would be perceived in many different kinds of ways. 1,000 years ago, they'd be nature spirits, or, they could be elves or fairies or gods or what have you. So I think that the impulse has always been there. I don't think that's actually gone away. I think we have actively attempted to suppress it with anthropocentrism, which basically cuts us off from the potential to be able to connect with persons outside of our species. We've convinced ourselves that we are alone unless there's, humanoid life on another planet. So that's one side of it. The other side is we can't wield enchantment. It is precisely the point that it's not something that we can force into existence. We can create the circumstances for it to naturally arise. Potentially, but we can't force it, and we can't, apply it as a sort of tool. There is a certain degree where the concept of re-enchantment feels farcical. It feels like an imposition of something fake as a sort of tool. And that's not the case. It is just there. It's a fundamental experience that we have.
Mm.
And it's really just a matter of taking the roadblocks out of the way so that we can continue to express it and experience it and allow that to be a real, legitimate, and valuable human experience. There have been plenty of re-enchantment attempts over, especially 19th, 20th centuries. And we've taken a lot of different approaches to it. I talk about this in my book, and I've talked about it elsewhere. You have the basic sort of premise proposed by scientists that the natural world is disenchanted. It's not magic. There is nothing magical to be found in it. It's just math and science, and you can understand all of it perfectly through those techniques. There's nothing enchanted about it. So then you have the other side, the folks that have historically taken it to be magical, that basically just took them up on that and said, okay, fine, then we will propose that there is another layer of experience. It is the supernatural, and the supernatural is where all of the magic is going to live. And you have, spiritualisms and theosophy and so on of, 19th, 20th centuries that have arisen to sort of re-enchant the world, but they haven't re-enchanted the world. They've just created this alternative dimension of reality that all the magic gets to live in, while keeping this world in the domain of the disenchanted sciences. Alternatively, you have things like Jungian psychoanalysis, which, for all of its many, merits and virtues, has inspired a lot of folks to perceive animals and plants and natural phenomena as being basically outward symbols or expressions of the human psyche. That if you have a dream of a fox, or if you encounter a fox on the road, this isn't necessarily Jung, but it's those that came after him and sort of expanded upon this way of thinking. Then it must be a sign from the universe. It must be a symbol for something that exists in human culture, and it isn't. It's a fox. Like their own thing going on. They have their own life. They're not there for us. They are living their own lives. We can have a genuine experience of enchantment if we recognize their personhood and enter into a kind of dynamic relationship with them in that moment. But if we just say, oh, it must be about the human experience, then that's not really enchantment.
That's nice, because that I think explores what Patrick was saying last week, the idea of concrete magic, and it feels like that's very much the sense of it. It is the sort of magic that is there in what is instantiated.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the way that something like theosophy, or this idea of the supernatural, you put the magic away there. So how does that differ then from the idea of Faërie as the place where Tolkien puts the magic? And I know that you will have an answer for this, but it sounds like I'm being very clever in tripping you up potentially.
Oh, once you bring up fairy stories, then this is a big can of worms that we're yeah, okay. So if we're gonna get into fairy stories, so fairy stories, I will read directly. Anyone, everyone, I do think that everyone should read Tolkien's essay on fairy stories.
It's a
Which
great essay.
really, yeah, it's one of the greatest things that he ever wrote. He wrote it originally as a lecture in 1939, which he delivered up in Scotland. Later on, edited it into a written essay. And there's an incredible version of it with commentary and notes, which is called Tolkien on Fairy Stories, edited by the magnificent Verlin Flieger and Douglas Anderson. And it is one of the greatest things that you will ever read. But he says in it, which I think is really important to sort of frame what I'm talking about when I talk about fairy stories. He says, quote, fairy stories are not in normal English usage stories about fairies or elves, but stories about Faërie, that is, Faërie, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Faërie contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. So this is him working again philologically from a more primary definition of Faërie before we started using that to refer solely to little wispy winged sprites in the woods. It was the domain of the Fays. It was a realm of experience, and it could certainly be described or defined as the domain of enchantment. And most of the fairy stories that we have are not true fairy stories, of which not all of them are. There are a lot of stories that we call fairy stories that are nothing of the sort, which he talks about at length in this essay. But true fairy stories usually aren't stories about fairies. They're stories about humans venturing into the shadowy marches of the perilous land of Faërie and their encounters with other beings in that space. It's really about the intersection. It's about the crossroads between the human and the other than human world. So these sorts of stories have a tremendous power. Ancient ones, he goes through the sort of varying theories of why we have fairy stories, where they come from, what they can actually offer us. He has his own proposition, which I will get to because it's valuable. Um, but yeah, these are a really important literary form, something that he felt deserved a lot more legitimate interest, not as sort of novelties, or certainly not as just children's stories, but as a serious form of literature that has some very peculiar sorts of capacities. But his sort of fundamental argument regarding fairy stories is that they have three primary functions, in addition to their more general function of offering an experience of enchantment. They offer three very specific functions of recovery, escape, and consolation. And every time I broach this topic, it always comes down to those functions, because each of those contain a universe of sort of explanation and investigation into the human experience and the value of enchantment. The escape being probably the most obvious. That's what we think about, when people talk about the values of a work like The Lord of the Rings. They say rather pejoratively that it's an escapist piece. It's a work of escapist fiction. And he embraced that in earnest, but sort of flipped it on its head, in that it's not an escape from the world. It's an escape into it. It's an escape from the accretions of millennia of anthropocentric ruthlessness. It's an escape from the sort of ontological shackles of disenchanted modernity, of business as usual, of capitalist profiteering and systematic exploitation, of instrumentalism. These themselves are prison bars that we've been placed in. And a fairy story, a good one, which could expand to, a great work of myth, in a more sort of earnest sense, that can help us escape from that. But if we want to escape from it, we need to first recover, which is the first of these fundamental functions that he talks about, which is recovery. And some of the most incredible writing in the essay is in this section on recovery, where he explains that recovery it has multiple meanings, of course. There is the recovery, return and renewal of health, which I think is very apropos here in terms of sort of return of existential health, certainly of planetary health. I think that these are very legitimate examples of recovery that enchantment can offer us. But it's also a regaining of a clear view, which he specifies very clearly as not seeing things as they really truly are, as I don't know, a particle physicist might, or a particularly haughty theologian, but rather the ways that we are meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. And I think if you replace things with beings there, that gets you to a really fundamental point here, is being able to really see others as others, to be able to acknowledge and appreciate their otherness. He has a great bit there. I'll come back to that in a second. Um, But this is fundamentally at odds with the ways that we are compelled to perceive the so-called natural world today, which is strictly in instrumentalist terms. We see others as resources, as things, as tools. Some humans we regard as other people that are worthy and have intrinsic value, but often not all of them. So a real recovery allows us to see things that have become trite, that have become things that we own, that we try to capture and appropriate, and it allows them to be freed up to actually take on their own lives and for us to be able to see them with a certain sense of intrinsic wonder and enchantment. So these are really important components of what fairy stories offer, this recovery. And if we can recover a clear view, if we can regain our existential health, then we have a chance of escaping. And this could be on a personal, existential, psychological level, but I think more sort of macroscopically, it can also be on a societal level. If we all are actually able to recover a more enchanted approach to engaging in the world, then we could escape the, you know, downward spiral into the bowels of the Anthropocene that we're currently stuck on. But this is the kind of work that leads us to that possibility. And then the end result is the consolation of the happy ending, which he has a lot to say about, some of which I don't really touch, but a lot of it I do, and I think it is useful to think about. But another important point, though, is also the fact that real good fairy stories often aren't so much about overt magic the ways that we think about them. I think this is one of the ways that modern fantasy often goes a bit wrong. If you read The Lord of the Rings, if you read The Hobbit, besides having some unusual types of beings, hobbits and elves and dwarves and so on, there isn't so much on the nose magic to be
No.
found. And he talks about this really explicitly. He says in the essay, fairy stories deal largely, or the better ones mainly, with simple or fundamental things, untouched by fantasy. But these simplicities are made all the more luminous by their setting. For the story maker who allows himself to be free with nature can be her lover, not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. And I always find it, especially knowing his work very well, just encountering those very simple words, very, Germanic Old English derived words, nothing overly flowery or sophisticated, these very basic things that we encounter constantly, but how evocative and potent they can actually be when they've been experienced through this sort of lens of enchantment. And there's a real power in that. There's a power in reframing the sort of conventional reality that we exist in, not to allow us to escape it and leave it behind, but to see it afresh, see it with new eyes.
Yes, I think that feels very powerful to me, and and again, that idea of the sort of concrete magic, the things themselves, the hasietas, I think, I don't know how to say that word, or ipseity of something, the very thingness of the thing, not your ideas about the thing, but and I think that is, that is incredibly powerful. So is there a difference then between fairy stories and myth? I mean, there is a difference between fairy stories and myth. Are they equally enchanting in different ways, do you think?
I think it really depends on the fairy story and it really depends on the myth. Um, there's a lot of ways that you could approach that, and it is a long-standing topic of conversation. Fairy stories have often been equated with folklore as the lore of the folk.
Mhm.
So the kinds of tales that would be shared in a much more intimate sort of setting, usually not by scholars of the great myths of old. They have a bit more flexibility, I think a certain degree of more earnestness to them. Myths can often start as fairy stories. Tolkien, believes strongly, and I think this is fairly well established at this point, that works like Beowulf started out as little more than a fairy story, which grew in the telling and became something a little bit more grandiose and substantial. But likewise, they can also go the other way. You can have a great sort of haughty, sophisticated body of myth, and out of that come more, sort of intimate fairy stories. I think a real fairy story needs to arise out of an experience of enchantment for the individual. It can be worked out. You can do it, building it block by block, knowing, what the good components would be, and try to create a compelling story from that. But it isn't necessarily going to have the same sort of qualia to it. It's not necessarily going to have the same effect. Perhaps it could, but I think a real, true fairy story needs to arise directly out of an experience of enchantment. And usually they don't have very um, overblown motives behind them. They're not seeking to, act as a charter myth for some sort of, institutionalized system of religion or science or governance or a nation state or something like that, which myths very frequently do. It's not the sort of, backbone of a people. Usually they're much more earnest. They're a little bit more down to earth. They don't have those really high aspirations for them, but they allow you to peek through into a fundamental sort of primal experience of the world that can bear morals and lessons, and there can be a sort of didactic component to them, certainly. But a real one shouldn't be, Tolkien would argue and did, intensively, that it shouldn't be strictly allegorical. It shouldn't be really a story about something else. And likewise, it shouldn't be a beast fable where a bunch of animals replace human characters and they act in place of the human. A modern example of this would be like Animal Farm by George Orwell. No one goes away from reading Animal Farm thinking about farm animals differently. That's not the primary takeaway from it. It's understood that they are a stand-in for the human, which isn't quite the same thing as a fairy story that brings you into the intersection between the human and the animal world, or where you experience what an animal's experience is actually like, what their life is really like. So there's differences, certainly, in certain ways between myth with a sort of capital M and fairy stories, but it's a fuzzy boundary.
I will ask you about mythos in a moment, but mentioning the Beast's Tale or the Beast Epic, I have been looking at for something else, the Roman de Renard. So this was a gathered collection of tales about the naughty fox Reynard, which originally came from, I think, medieval France and then was translated into a kind of Middle English by Thomas Caxton, and has subsequently been sort of, well, child storyified. But that I don't know if you've read it, but it is, I mean, the fox is, well, he's a lovable rogue if your idea of a rogue can sort of embrace really some quite horrible things. But it is a satire to the extent that there is a court. So the lion is the lord, and then there are the barons who are, the wolf's a baron, but also Chanticleer the cockerel is a baron, and the wolf is one of the barons who just doesn't obey the rules of the court, and he's not a good Christian, and all these kind of things. So there is this level of satire in it, and you can imagine, and there are wicked priests and who get their comeuppance and so on and so forth. You can imagine it being laughed at, but at the same time there is this different level of gusto, like as you find in Chaucer, that is just something that's so profoundly different from anything that maybe there are some sort of clever sort of darkly humorous literary fiction. I'm thinking of Percival Everett. Maybe his type of his work has that kind of quality, and it's definitely not a fairy tale, but there's something clarifying about this level of gusto and abrasiveness within those kind of texts. So it's interesting that there might be very different ways at getting at different facets of an enchantment experience. Maybe sort of a purist sense might be, as Tolkien experienced when he first heard those words about Eärendel, that might be the sort of like purest level, but maybe there are sort of like other levels which could involve a sort of, humor and
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, humor as well as darkness. I mean, this is,
Yes,
this
yes.
is a major part of, sort of folklore studies and folks trying to sort of tear apart fairy stories and determine what they are and why they exist and why we keep telling them. And there was the philological approach with Max Mueller and solar mythology, which I won't. It's a whole rabbit hole to get down. But then there was like the Andrew Lang sort of school of thought, the anthropological approach, which was basically claiming that these were sort of repositories of ancient barbaric practices that humans used to engage in. Because you read a lot of fairy stories and you have
Yeah,
things in
they're
there. You have
horrible.
cannibalism, you have incest, you have,
Yeah.
terrible. And the anthropological approach at the time, this was a different era of anthropology, was that, oh, this is what the primitives used to do before we were civilized by Christianity and, the civilization of modernity. And Tolkien completely just chucked all of that in the bin. He thought that both approaches were dead ends. He preferred a literary approach, treating them as serious stories and analyzing them as such, which I think is a much more valuable way to look at them. Criticizing the soup was his sort of analogy for that, as opposed to trying to pick apart all the ingredients and figure out, how much saffron went into it and how many potatoes went into it, and trying to sort of tear it apart. Instead, you need to analyze the taste of it. You need to analyze the particular taste of this spoonful of this bowl of the soup that you've been served, because it will change constantly. And our stories do indeed change constantly. They go through, endless periods of evolution and reworking over time. And that's part of their dynamism as these living repositories of enchantment, of knowledge, of wisdom, of fears and anxieties. There's so much that goes into them.
Yes, and that's interesting about the stories changing, because of course most of Shakespeare's plays are based on, other stories. I mean, he was retelling those stories, and of course for hundreds of years, King Lear had a happy ending, and so you see how what we demand out of a story changes. But of course Tolkien does have this idea of the happy ending, the eucatastrophe, which sort of maybe we'll get into. But I think there's something to be said for misery personally, but maybe that's just my frame of mind.
Yeah, and he does certainly have stories that are not. I mean, the eucatastrophe of the whole Middle Earth legendarium is the destruction of the ring and the happy ending at the end of the Third Age. And I mean, to be fair, he did start on a sequel to it, which then undid a lot of that. But you have these horrific stories from the First Age. My God, Turin Turamba, or the Children of Húrin, is devastating and grim, and there's very dark matters in it. But it's the ultimate, eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe that comes at the end of the Lord of the Rings that sort of brings that to a point of completion. Of course, him as a Christian as well, there's a certain degree of his own sort of Christian interpretation of things, perceiving Christ's coming as being the, sort of eucatastrophe of man, which is the bit of it that I don't touch really as a non-Christian, but it's valuable for understanding his approach, because he was very much caught between worlds in a certain sense. There's been a lot of discussion of, is it pagan? Is it Christian? Is it other? Is it a synthesis? And there's sort of two approaches to the human story. There's the sort of universal final defeat of works like Beowulf, and then you have this sort of redemptive evangelium of the Christian story, and there's a tension between them that you can always discern in his work. And I think that, at least in terms of a fairy story, to fit the bill as a fairy story, you need to have the consolation of a happy ending, but that isn't necessarily because he was a cockeyed optimist by any stretch of the imagination. He was a deeply depressive person by nature. But he thought that was an important component of it, or an important part of its function. The thing that it offers us is that consolation.
Now, I really should get us to focus very specifically on the more than human world before we go to questions, because we've got some in the chat now. But how do you feel that this, because you're very interested in the more than human world. I mean, your book is really related, to re-seeing, or seeing the full life and the full potential of the other in outside of us. So how do you feel that enchantment and the more than human, as getting out of this anthropocentric bubble, how do those two things strengthen each other?
I mean, as I said before, an experience of enchantment can completely upend everything that we think we know about the ordering of our world. When you look at the grand scheme of things, the grand, longue durée sort of history of humanity as a species, and if you were to take, if you were to put in a spreadsheet all of the different ontological frameworks that we have operated on over the course of our very vast history as a species, 99.99999% of them would have disagreed with our modernist assumption of an anthropocentric world wherein humans are the only beings that are agentive, that are aware and meaningfully sentient, and that the world is centered around us justly so. That this is how it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be in the middle. We're the only ones that have moral value. We're the only ones that are moral agents, and everyone else can be safely utilized and exploited as objects and resources and tools and so on. The vast majority of human societies throughout history have disagreed with that. That isn't to make a claim for some sort of like noble savage trope that everyone was just like living in peace and harmony and getting along and no one was hurting anyone. Obviously, that's not true. But harm itself is a relational experience.
Yeah.
It is between persons. Violence is relational. The problem that we have today is not just that we have violence. Let's get, as the classic, human, non-human example, our treatment of animals. It's not just that we are violent towards the animals that we exploit for food and other purposes. It's that we don't even perceive that to be violence because we have completely wiped away any possibility of regarding them as persons. And you can't be violent towards something that's not a person. I can't be violent towards a rock. If I'm not regarding rocks as persons. So yeah, you can't be violent towards a livestock animal. They're literally livestock. They are objects. So that worldview is the odd man out in the grand scheme of things. That is an unusual, enigmatic position which is not founded upon science at all. It's strictly founded upon a very specific lineage of philosophical, religious, and pseudoscientific thought that brings us into modernity, which I talk about at length in the book.
Mm.
What enchantment does is it breaks us free from that delusion. That is one of the escapes that a fairy story can offer us, that an experience of enchantment can offer us, is an escape from that, which again is much more primal. It's much more primordial. It's a fundamental experience that humans have always had the capacity of having, and maybe more than just humans. But it troubles that idea really fundamentally. It is antithetical to the sort of modernist instrumentalist ontology that we live by. So I think it has tremendous potential to, push us to reconsider our place in the world when we have that kind of enchanted experience with an other than human being, or not even just with discrete organisms, which is a big part of the reason why I'm a big fan of like nature spirit paradigms. It's not because I earnestly believe in the sincere existence of nature spirits. I don't know. I'm agnostic to it. I like the idea and I talk about it a lot, but it's not from a place of like, oh, I see elves, therefore I like, think they exist. It's not that. It's that it gives us the ability to go beyond discrete biological organisms. It gives us the ability to personify things like rivers and mountains and forests,
Mhm.
all kinds of different, non-biological beings or holobiont beings, compound organisms. And it
Mhm.
gives us a kind of way to interface with them and to perceive them as persons, even if the version of them that we have in our heads isn't really what they look like or who they are. But it's an easier way for us to be able to enter into a sort of social accord with them and social dynamic with them. And that's something that an experience of enchantment can go hand in hand with. Um, they can feed into each other, I suppose. If we are open to the possibility of the personhood of a river, then we're allowing ourselves the potential to have an experience of enchantment with a river. And likewise, if we have that experience of enchantment, then that might lead us to start thinking about rivers differently. So I think it certainly, they're very closely related.
I think
Faërie, oh, go ahead.
I was just thinking as you were talking. I mean, there is this kind of chicken and egg thing about it. I was thinking about the end of Robert Macfarlane's, well, towards the end of Robert Macfarlane's Is a River Alive book, and he's standing, and this is a river in Canada, and there's a big waterfall, and I think he's standing by a big waterfall. Anyway, he's standing there, and he is he is in a state of enchantment with the river, and there is this radical alterity of the river. I mean, why should I think he says at one point, why should I assume that when a river speaks I would necessarily be able to understand what the river's saying? But nonetheless, he has this profound experience, of the aliveness of the river. And this comes towards the end of the book, and he's gone through these processes of thinking about it, exploring it, and being with people who have these very strong and intense connections to the waterways and other more than human life forms around him. So he's cultivated this this state of great openness. And I'm thinking also about, in George Monbiot's book, what's it called, Regeneration or Regenesis or whatever it's called, where he talks about sort of farming systems. There's a chapter where he talks about the soil, and he's got one of those those little eyeglasses, and he looks at the soil, and you can see all this life in there. And again, it's like that process of, he had opened himself up to thinking about the richness of soil, but having been opened, having put himself in the position and allowed himself to be open to that, then taking one of those jeweler's lenses and looking into the earth becomes not a matter of counting springtails, but a matter of absolute awe at the generativity of life that's there. But in both of these cases, obviously, these people have, they have put themselves there, and then the enchantment is both a reward and a motivation, and continuance of a virtuous cycle, because I'm labeling it. But how does one put? I mean, and this is where you can't re-enchant the world comes in, because one would like to say, so how does one make everyone be open to this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that an important, again, I don't think that we can forcefully re-enchant everyone. Maybe dropping some
Come
like
on, you be
I,
re-enchanted or else.
yeah, exactly. Maybe like putting some, I don't know, psilocybin drops in the UN conference or something like that might do something for it. But what we can do is we can remove some of the stops that have been put in place to prevent us from having that experience of enchantment. And I think that that is something that we can do honestly. I mean, in one sense, simply by just understanding science beyond what the average layman does when it comes to animal sciences, plant neurobiology, things like that. Some of these are relatively novel fields. A lot of this research is just coming out of the past 30 years, especially when it comes to understanding vegetal intelligence. And I think that if folks really understand where the research actually is at on the science side of things, and if we look at that with a clearer head, then it'll automatically take away some of the stops that we've put in place. Very much the same thing with animals, but looking maybe over the past 100 years, not even 50 years, a little bit more. Basically since like Jane Goodall, that we start to actually take animal behavior seriously. But when we actually look at it, and when we, allow ourselves to sort of problematize some of our pre-existing, notions about an animal's inner life, and get over this absurd, claim of anthropomorphism being the gravest sin of that you could possibly make. Anthropomorphism is, I could go on the soapbox about that, but I'm not going to waste the time doing that. We should be much more concerned about anthropocentrism. So if we can start to break that down, then that'll open us up a lot more to have these very fundamental experiences, which can arise in manifold contexts, and it's going to be individual for each individual person and for every experience that you have. It's very much not something that we can force, but it is something that we can allow. We can create the conditions for it to emerge organically. and allow it to exist without being immediately overlaid with an explanatory framework that is intrinsically designed to bring us back towards either an anthropocentric worldview or a vertical sort of hierarchical system that leads us towards a singular omnipotent overlord of the universe. So if we can stay in that space of genuine awe and wonder, and if we can create the circumstances for it to arise, then I think it'll naturally have an effect that I do think is fundamentally positive. But it's interesting you make that comment about McFarlane talking about like how silly to think that if a river did speak to me that I would even understand. And that's a very real thing. And it reminds me of something Tolkien said in one of his drafts of the On Fairy Stories essay. He says something to the effect of like, if fairies are real, which I do think he did genuinely believe that they were. But if they're real, then certainly the stories that we tell about them have nothing to do with them. They aren't really about them. They're our projections and our sort of assumptions about what it would be like to be them and what their lives must be like. Because they're not there for us. They're not, he says specifically, they're not, some lost, branch of the human race. They're not angels or demons that are sent to bless us or torture us. They're not spirits of the dead and so on. They're just other kinds of beings who live in a very peculiar way to our own, that live very differently from us and have a very different perspective on things. But even just to think about that as a possibility, to sort of wax poetic on the possibility of another very hypersentient form of life that has an experience of the world that's different from ours, even in just a very minor seemingly way, as being immortal or being incredibly longeval. That's a big shift, and just thinking through the complexities of that can give rise to a lot of really interesting insights about the human experience and about our place in a more than human world. So I think that even if we don't understand them perfectly, who knows? Just acting as if, approaching it in a subjunctive mode, if you will, gives you the ability to think through things with a lot more nuance and dynamism than we usually do. And who knows? Who knows when you're talking to a tree and you get a little bit of tree wisdom, yeah, certainly maybe your brain just came up with it based on the things that you think a tree would say. But who am I to know? I don't know. There's so much that we don't know about the world that we live in. There's so much that we don't know about our own brains. Yeah, certainly. Who knows? Maybe it's possible that the tree is letting a little bit of their tree wisdom get through to you.
Thank you. And Erik and I have talked about my tree conversations before, and I was going to, and I had sort of primed a question to the idea of exactly that place. And I think you're saying it beautifully, that as if place. And I think that's a very fertile place, that liminal realm, that that's a sort of a kind of ambivalence, or not ambivalence, ambiguity. It allows for an opening of possibility. Now, in the chat, I don't know if any of you would like to ask your questions in aloud, or make your comments aloud, either Eileen, Kathleen, or Molly. If anyone unmuted themselves, I would notice it very swiftly. Eileen.
Well, I don't really have a question. It's more of a commentary. And I think that this idea of redemption and recovery is really important, because my personal experience is having a sense of enchantment from a very, very young age, and never really letting go of that part of me. There have been times during my life, like when I was a teenager, and, I just didn't have time for that stuff in my brain and didn't really think about it, but never doubting that it was real. And really my first experience of it was born out of what many people's is in history, in human history, and what many of the mythology you're talking about is in a time of great despair and fear, we are meaning makers as humans. And so my little brain did that, and to some degree, my mother cultivated that, and she kept that ground very fertile. So I might have been fortunate in that sense. But it was something that I didn't realize until my mother died. And now this is more than 30 years ago now, but that those early, that early sense that I had, one was looking out at the stars and realizing how small I was, and that that's where I belonged. And I've mentioned that on this series before. The other one was that I was so connected to animals that any chance I could get, particularly elephants, that at a very young age, when I was taken to the circus at Madison Square Garden, you used to be able to feed the elephants before the circus if you bought peanuts. And I was so little, I could see the chain on the elephant's leg. And I burst into tears. And I never went back to the circus again until my parents said I wouldn't. So there was always that part of me. And so I think this idea of recovery and unlayering it, I now live believing that there is an unseen world which I don't understand and which I may give meaning to, and I may be correct. However, I also know there's an observer effect. So by me already being aware that there is, I believe in fairies. I think I mentioned it a few sessions ago in this Living One series, that there was something flitting around the ceiling at the ceiling height when my mother was dying, and I was half asleep. It woke me up, and my thought was, oh, it's a fairy, and I went back to sleep. I've never questioned it. I've never doubted it. And I still think I see them sometimes, and that may be interdimensional. I can't really say what it is, but I think an important thing and this is the point I wanted to make about the enchantment, that as you were describing it, is that it can be life altering. In my case, it was almost life guiding, because of course I went on to work with animals, and that's how I met Gay and know about Carulas and everything. And that was just intuitive. I didn't even know I knew what I was doing until Gay told me I knew what I was doing. So it can direct our lives if we really allow it in, much like religion. And I'm not part of an organized religion, but those who really believe in whatever sense people believe in the paranormal, I think it can be guide their lives and be a part of their value system and morality. And so I think one of the questions was, how do we make this fertile ground for people to have this experience? In my experience with changing people's ultimate thinking, like becoming vegan, it's been my living experience, and not being afraid to share it, not being afraid to say, oh, well, that was a fairy. And if someone thinks I'm wacko, okay, well, they can. I mean, my father does all the time. He doesn't believe in the whole ancient aliens theory. I've had so many arguments with him. He doesn't even believe in the possibility of it. So some people will be closed to it and are never going to get it. Other people, by us talking about it even, may become more open to it. To me, that's how you create the fertile ground, is by the living example of being in both worlds. And somebody Molly mentioned, I think, Carl Jung, and that's true too. So maybe the dream state is just as real as the waking state. Certainly the Australian Aboriginals believe that. And their dream state is a little different than what we are talking about. But the dream time, they think it's as real as this world here. And I believe that too. And that brings up all these quantum things too, as well. Do we manifest it? Is it a holographic universe? All of that. But in one way or another throughout history, it has impacted human behavior in a profound way. And I think people being disconnected from that that separation does create a lot of the destruction we see, the violence we see, and the interpersonal violence. Okay, talked enough. but thank you, because I think this is a really important discussion, and I think it can really help heal humanity and our planet. So thank you very much for your work.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. Mike McCoy's put a message in the chat. I don't know if you want to speak, Mike, or if you want me to read it out. I'll see if you
maybe you just read it out, because I think the concept was put forward in the 1800s, and I wonder if that was the beginning of a whole discussion in the United States. Von Humboldt, made a comment about Thoreau and Emerson, and but I don't know if it's even worth talking about. Maybe it isn't open for this discussion.
Mike wrote, can transcendentalism as a philosophical, spiritual and literary movement in 19th century New England that emphasized intuitive spiritual knowledge over empirical sensory experience with Emerson and Henry David Thoreau be considered in this discussion?
Yeah, I think certainly. I have been to Walden Pond. I grew up in New England. I live in Old England now. I just grew up not so far from Walden, so I've been there multiple times. Yeah, I do think I think there are elements of that movement that tie into the sort of attempts at quote unquote re-enchantment and attempts to find meaning. Certainly, I think there's a lot of meaning making in a lot of the different kinds of movements that emerged during that time, which I also appreciate was brought up by Eileen as well. And it is the search for meaning, I think, is a perennial factor in all of this. And I do think that enchantment can provide us with a deep sense of it. A lot of different components that lead to meaning making both individually and collectively. As far as transcendentalism, it's interesting because I think that it can be a valuable framework. I think there's a risk sometimes of completely distancing ourselves from empiricism and rationality, and I think that that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake for a lot of reasons. I think that it actually limits our capacity for enchantment, and it pushes us into what Tolkien called morbid delusion, which I think is a rather excellent term. He has a great quote about that, saying essentially that if humans ever get into a state where they cannot connect with sort of facts and evidence, or they can't deal in truth, then fantasy itself and the experience of enchantment will languish and will fall into morbid delusion. And I think that we see that a lot in religion, but not just in mainstream religion. We see it in a lot of different attempts at meaning making, which tend to bypass logic and reason under the presupposition that the sort of visible physical world that we live in is sort of base and bad, which is really pulling from an almost Gnostic sort of mentality, not in a like, I'm not saying Gnostic in a good way, like in the sense of like the real world is bad and we have to transcend it in order to get to real reality, which lies somewhere out there. It's somewhere in a sort of higher, domain or sort of realm of experience. I'm not a big fan of that sort of approach to things. I'm much more interested in a more immanentist, sort of approach that brings us down into the earth, that brings us into reality. I find, there's a lot of strategies that we employ to deal with existential anxieties. We have these fundamental existential anxieties surrounding death and, isolation and meaninglessness and freedom. We're terrified of those things, and yet we are confronted with them directly. And we can take a few different approaches to dealing with them. We can dismiss them entirely and just say, well, actually, there is no death. I'll just go on forever, and I'm confident in that, then I don't have to deal with it. I can say, oh, there's no such thing as freedom because I know that there is, spirit is telling me what to do, or God is, moving all the pieces and dictating everything, or there's a set of rules in this book and I just have to follow them, and that's all I have to do. I don't have to figure it out for myself. And I think that's probably the most popular approach that we've taken to dealing with existential angst. And transcendence, I think, is a part of that. It ties into it, not necessarily in Thoreau's approach to the term, but certainly in more general approaches to the concept of, what is the meaning of life, to transcend the world. I don't know if that's the best approach to be taking. I think that it arises out of some concerning presuppositions about the nature of the world and about the nature of ourselves.
But Einstein said that intuition is the leader and the rational mind is the follower. I don't know exactly what he meant by that, but he said our intuitive mind really leads us, where our rational mind follows the leader. And
yet they're both there. And I think it's true to a point. I think even with, processes of scientific discovery, it's often, the inquisitive, curious mind that leads the charge and asks the questions. And then it's the rational mind that works out the details and comes to some sort of as good of a conclusion as it can come to. But I think it is important, nevertheless, that both are present. There needs to be a side-by-side holding hands process of allowing for intuitive space, allowing for, what we could very well call spiritual or mystic experience. I think this is a fundamental need that we have as human beings, but to do so without abandoning our reason and without falling into patterns of cognitive dissonance or conspiracy. Because those can take us down some not so healthy rabbit holes, as we have seen as a society in abundance. We have to engage both sides, I think. But it is, I would certainly agree that there are limitations to what we currently know. And I think scientists are the very first to admit that. That's why they do science. It is a process of endless discovery and refinement of what we already know. And if we discover that the things that we thought we knew are actually wrong, then great. Cool. Then now we know, and then we can start to investigate what it may be. I think the great example of this for the present discussion is like plants. It's like a lot of people have known for millennia that plants are kinds of persons. And, we have vast mythic traditions, not mythic traditions, cultural traditions that have, never lost sight of that. It's in their language, it's in the stories that they tell, it's in the ways that they live. But it's really only like the past 30 years that we've, started to come back around to it. We had René Desfontaines in the 18th century in Paris that did an experiment that suggested that plants might actually be able to retain memory. But then we just kind of buried that and didn't think about it for hundreds of years. And then it was really in the past 30 years that we have researchers reinvestigating those things. And it's upending a lot of presuppositions that we had about the world that we live in. But there's a need to have them go hand in hand. I think that it's very risky to abandon reason and science just because it hasn't always been correct about everything. That's the point.
Thank you.
Yes, I think Ian McGilchrist in The Master and His Emissary makes quite a good, that good metaphor. So for those of you who might not have read that book or come across it, it's related to a story from, I can't remember what tradition, of the master of a country has an emissary who he sends out to find out information and work things out and strategize and do all these really important tasks, which are crucial for the way that you have a sort of well-run society or whatever the analogy might be. And but after a while, while the emissary sort of thinks to himself, well, you know, I'm doing all this work, I'm finding out all this stuff, I'm doing all the organizing, I really should be in charge. But when he's in charge, he's a tyrant, and he can't see the bigger picture. All he can think about is you know, quantities rather than qualities, and he thinks about the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law, and he's just a horrible person to be around. What you need then to have is to have that master vision coming back over and taking the information that's been found and integrating it back into a holistic view of the world. So you have this backwards and forwards process of going from a wide perspective of this is the gestalt, it's all moving, it's all changing, it's all connected. And then you look into one specific aspect of it in great detail so that you understand it. And then when you look out again, it's like, oh my God, I see now something else in this big, vast picture. And I think that very nicely sort of gives us a suggestion of the way that these different aspects of us are intended to work together. That makes it teleological, but you know, work well together, or enable the sort of best potential of us when they are in some kind of harmony.
100%.
Mr. Curry, who's here listening to your name taken in vain a few times, I don't know if you would like to have a word with Patrick. I know that you two are friends, because it was indeed Erik who suggested that I should get in touch with you, and that you would be kind enough to appear on Living One, for which we're very grateful.
Well, I just want to say I thoroughly enjoyed that, and don't feel that anything important was missed out whatsoever. It's a special pleasure for me to hear somebody like Erik talk about enchantment, because it gets me out of my echo chamber of my head, and I get to hear the ideas, the same ideas, but I get to hear them from your perspective, Erik, or other perspectives. It's very refreshing for me. I only thought of two quotations, both of which you know, I think. Tolkien said something about enchantment enables us to break out of the adamantine ring of the known.
Yeah, I was going to mention that quote at the end.
In other words, what he means by the known is what we think we know. So we think, oh yeah, the world, or some part of the world. Yeah, we understand that already. That's taken care of, and that's an illusion, of course. We don't really know it. And the other quotation I love from Tolkien is that if human beings ever couldn't tell the difference between frogs and kings, there would be no stories about frog kings. No, you need the so-called rational understanding is part of the enchantment, which transcends it. You actually need both of them. You can't transcend something that isn't there for you. So anyway, Erik knows this very well. But thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for being here. I do love those quotes. The first one is what I wanted to close everything with, because it's
right. Sorry.
but yeah, I'll give the whole quote. But that's
the whole quote.
And the Frog King one is also excellent. I was thinking about that just yesterday, actually, and thought about inserting it in the paper. But it's an excellent point, and he is very dedicated to this, which is one of the reasons why his work is so scrupulous. You know, I mean, you know, Patrick knows this very well. It's very interesting. Patrick and I have these ridiculously high number of areas of intersection in our interests and our areas of research, from Buddhism to Tolkien to environmental ethics to even like dabblings in astrology for, you know, a good period of time. Like for some reason, we've sort of run in these like, you know, parallel lines in you know, slightly different age brackets, but nevertheless, you know, sort of running these same circles, which has always been very, it's a pleasure to you know, have him in my life. But yeah, his work is, his process of composition was very much a process of uncovering and discovering. And he demanded for himself, and he demands of fairy stories as a whole, an interconsistency of reality, because it is only when you have that interconsistency of reality that you can foster an experience of what he calls secondary belief, which I call the subjunctive mode. This is the as if. It's your ability to step into it and, for a time at least, experience it as if it were real. But it is secondary belief. belief. It isn't primary belief, nor is it suspension of disbelief. It's not merely repressing your sort of doubts. It's this secondary, sort of subjunctive mode of experience that allows for the endless possibility to exist, but it still has to have its internal logic and reason, because we are rational beings, and it behooves us to remain rational beings. It behooves us to not abandon that. So I love the frog prince line. That is gold.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick. One I saw in the chat from Kat, and Kat, when Patrick's talk is up on YouTube, I think that will go some way towards answering your question, because Kat asks, does phenomenology tie into enchantment, and if so, how? So now that you're both there, I don't know if you and it's a very large question for a sentence or so on, but I guess the answer is yes. And then how?
Yes, well, that takes care of it. Well, can I say something, Eric?
Please. No, I was going to ask you to. That's great.
The only phenomenologist whose work I know very well, I know at all, is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and I think his work is really relevant to enchantment, because he describes in almost so many words the imagination as an organ of discovery, and what it discovers is the inner lining and meaning of circumstances. So that's like pure concrete magic. He says you don't find meaning by transcending this circumstances, and circumstances is just about nearly everything, perceptible or palpable or whatever. You discover meaning by going into it more deeply. So it's an immanent kind of transcendence, and I don't see what could be more relevant. So yeah, a big fan of his work, particularly his last posthumously published book, The Visible and the Invisible. Not easy going, but it's well worth it.
It's very good if you have somebody else's notes on it, I find.
Ah, yes. Yes, well, I could probably help out in that respect.
You already have, thank you. Yes, Eric, I don't know if you have anything to say to that.
Yes, the answer is yes.
Oh, good.
That's it. There's a million tracks that you could take down that road. I think embodiment also becomes an important part of that.
Oh, totally. I forgot to say that. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's absolutely. It's sort of closely related, but that's a massive topic. That certainly is more suited for answering to begin with. So I would defer to him.
I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you've come across, I saw this in an independent bookshop and bought it. Jackie Morris, she's an illustrator, and she's collaborated with Robert Macfarlane on some books about lost words and so forth. She's collaborated with an artist who paints on glass, and they've written a book of fairy stories called Wild Folk, Tales from the Stones. And so it was a book that was actually crowdfunded in order to be published. And it has this artwork that is just stunningly beautiful. If I share screen, I might be able to just okay, here we go. So this is kind of as good as it gets to show you, except so the artwork is very beautiful. It's all painted on glass, but these are they're folk tales or tales from the stones written for this collaborative project with this lovely artwork. And I've been reading them, and I think they are lovely and they are interesting, but I'm not entirely sure if they completely and 100% fit all the categories of fairy tales, but I think it's interesting that these projects are very powerfully still current and still being sought after.
Yeah. And I think experiencing a bit of a revival. Robert Macfarlane's work is obviously incredible. You mentioned the book with the sort of lost words, landmarks.
Yes.
which is an absolute favorite of mine. For anyone, I think, especially that lives in the British Isles, it's really indispensable because he basically has collected hundreds of different toponyms, specific terms used for places or landmark features. And it's sort of, from all across the British Isles. So, you have old Gaelic terms, you have Welsh terms, you have old terms from Cornwall and from East Anglia and all over the place, terms that might be used by fishers or might be used, in old folkloric materials or old, books from the 18th century but are no longer in use and so on. But they're very specific terms. And he has a great quote that he takes from the poet Wendell Berry, which I think is really important, and it does tie into a lot of this process. With part of what obviously part of what makes Tolkien's work so incredible is that he was a philologist and he approaches the work and the language side by side. He claimed language comes first. I think the reality is somewhere closer to in between. They fed each other. Stories came out of words and words came out of stories. But to have specific words and to re-enchant our experience of language and the language that we use to speak about the world that we live in, that is an important part of this process because the language that we use really sort of forms the scaffolding of the way that we move throughout the world and the way that we think about things. And he has a great quote from Wendell Berry, in which he says, the quote starts with something like, "We know enough about our history up to this point to know that," and then he starts, "people exploit what they have merely concluded to be of value, but they defend what they love." Mm-hmm. And to defend what we love, we need a particularizing language, for we love what we particularly know. And I think that that can be applied in language and it can be applied in story. If we only ever tell stories about human dramas, which is what we consider to be authentic, like real, sophisticated, important literature today, then that is all that we're ever going to take seriously and value. If we start to tell stories about the particulars of the world that we live in, if we stretch beyond the human and start telling stories, as McFarlane has done, about, and a number of other authors as well, about, trees and about animals and about rivers. And, if we start to tell their stories and use words for them that are more specific, more particular, if we say their names instead of just saying, "Oh, that hill over there." If we talk about, what specific kind of hill is it? Is it a seat? Is it, like Arthur's seat in Edinburgh? And if it is, then what does that mean? When we dive into those sorts of words, when we start to provide a more particularizing language or telling particular stories, it does deepen our capacity to actually care about them.
It totally. I had two quick interruptions there. The farm that I was mainly brought up on as a child, we had. It had been a farm. There had been a property there. There was a Roman road that passed through it, so there had been a dwelling there for like 2,000 years, and there had been a farm there with records. It had been, going back a very long time because during the Reclamation, so in King Henry VIII's time, this farm had been taken by the Crown and gifted to one of the Cambridge colleges, Gonville and Caius College. And so Gonville and Caius College in Cambridge had all the records of this farm. So we knew that in such and such a year, this woman was the landowner there who was called Johanna Summers, and she had to fill in, or she had to send accounts to the college. And so the fields all had names. So it wasn't just like, that Northwest or Paddock 2, it was Bakesea Meadow and Plum Park. And, suddenly when you're, that piece of land is not just a field, that's Bakesea Meadow. that really does, change the way that you feel about something. It is very, very personal and particular. And the other thing that was just as exciting, I have forgotten because I got so excited about the name of the field. But it is, then those specific names for things and of normal places. I know what it was. I watched this documentary about the San people that was directed by the octopus teacher guy and his brother. So it's from 20 years ago or something, and it's called The Great Dance, and it's all the way through narrated in translation, but all the words are from one of the hunters. And so one of the things, there's a particular word, and I can't remember, it means three things, but one of the things it means is dance. And I was thinking about it when you were talking about enchantment and being in the song, because I think in that situation, the being in the dance, he said, when I'm hunting, it's just like when I'm dancing, my body is happy. And that sense of a real connection to the process of living. And also a sort of like deep emphasizing after, 4 hours into the running hunt, I become Kudu, the running hunter, and they've done it very, very cleverly with the cinematography. So you are sort of changing perspective. But one of the things that struck me was my father told me how to navigate. So you recognize certain trees by the shapes that they are. It's not a tree. This is an individual. I know where I am because I am close to that individual. And it's that deep particularization that I think we often do tend to miss out on.
Oh, absolutely. And it's also, the ideal is to be able to recognize an individual tree as an individual, but even just the slightly more macro level of being able to recognize a species, that's the kind of knowledge that our ancestors have had for hundreds of thousands of years. We are among the very first generations of human beings, relatively speaking, that do not have relatively encyclopedic knowledge or identifying capability of the kinds of plants that live and fungi and animals that live in our midst, which is really, really a loss. I think Charlotte talked about that actually. Just their names. And I mean, that's, not even the level of like, is it safe to eat? Is it medicinal? Will it kill me? Like that would be ideal. But, just having the very basic knowledge of like, okay, that's a hawthorn tree, that's a rowan tree, that's a sycamore, that's a pine, that's a yew. These are things that kids coming up today are completely disconnected from in many parts of, I speak for Britain, which is already kind of heads and shoulders above where a lot of folks are in the States. I've always found that in the UK, there is still, at least in older generations, more of a living knowledge of recognizing individual plants and trees and so on and knowing their names. I found that much more here than I ever found that in the States, depending on which communities they're talking about, obviously, but speaking in generals. But I do think that sort of knowledge, even just knowing the species name, even just knowing its folk name, just knowing that that's a Mayflower. You don't need to know that it's Crataegus levitica or even know that it's hawthorn. But if you know that it's a Mayflower, then you are tying yourself into a part of that story. And then, it brings you deeper into the experience of relationship with it. Then you think, oh yeah, Mayflower May Day. Oh yeah, that's when people used to pick the Mayflowers. And oh, wasn't there some sort of thing about like you shouldn't bring them inside? Oh yeah, because they smell a little bit like death. Oh, that's that smell of decay. That's why there was, it brings you into the world of relationship with the plant that, really enriches our experience of being living beings in a living world. There was something else that you said that I wanted to respond to, and I forgot what it is. Yeah, John, but it was something.
You show off. That was actually the right Linnaean name for Hawthorne.
Hawthorne. I know Hawthorne very well. I know Hawthorne very well. I was also an herbalist for a long time, so I do know random Latin binomials.
Oh, okay. But I was thinking there, like the names of plants, like dandelion, called pissenlit in French, wet the bed, and it is a diuretic. So a lot of the time the common names for the plants were also information about the plant.
Absolutely.
So, I've seen Eileen has a hand up there.
Well, I just wanted to add that, there's so much that can be said on this topic. Obviously, we could probably talk for hours about this and all the examples, but I have been fortunate, I think, one, my mother was very connected to the unseen and very open to the unknown and being humbled by it. But I've also been fortunate in that the last few years, 3-4 years, I have been working and mostly training in the end of life space. And as many of us know, when someone is at the end of life, for many people around them, all other things fall away. I mean, you drop everything you're doing, you come and visit, and yet one of the other things that happens is people are not afraid then to talk about the unseen. And that for me opened up a lot when my mother passed. And so being in the end of life space not only means, we're open to the unseen, and what happens after death? Do we go on? All of these existential questions, and need to straddle that world, because the person who is leaving this form in this embodiment that they have is often experiencing things that are unseen. And yet they're very real to that person. And in fact, they often follow very real history. And so I think this whole idea of mythology is so important. And when we say, oh, it's just mythology, it didn't really happen, there is always a grain of truth in that. And that's our innate human wisdom as being part of this universe. And we're all made of stardust. Everything around us is. We're all interconnected. And quantum entanglement says there's a part of us, everything that is, there's a part of it in us also. And that's part of the end of life space, is being able to be so open that your own beliefs aren't even there. And then if someone tells you this is their belief system, I don't doubt it. I mean, it is certainly possible. And it may be their experience, even if it's not mine, because it may be happening in a different dimension. So it's the one space where I think modern society sometimes allows for this kind of enchantment and humility, and not an anthropocentric world. So I just wanted to add that comment that I think when we talk about life and death, people are more willing to talk about the unseen and being enchanted.
Thank you. I know Mike's made a comment about Jane Goodall, of course, naming all of the animals. She started moving away from numbers, which also has been done in many of the elephant studies, and is certainly a vast improvement on B73 or whatever else. And Kathleen commenting, yes, of course, trees are individuals, and that's the way she navigates, and would be totally lost if she lost that ability to recognize trees as individuals. I don't know if anyone else has a specific question that they have to answer, but I feel that we've taken up quite a lot of Erik's time this evening, and unless anyone has something particularly urgent that they would like to ask him right here, right now, I would like to thank him greatly for being with us this evening for the second time, and it's been just as much a delight as your first appearance was, so thank you very much indeed. And it was lovely having Patrick too, and that little interaction between you, because you are sort of connected in my thinking with Erik having recommended Patrick, and Patrick keen to see Erik. It's very nice to have that collegiate atmosphere among the speakers as well as amongst the community of learners. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. And
thank you, Missy.
And I will hand over to Olivia to see us out. Oh, Erik. Oh, you've got a final quote.
Yeah. Speaking of the collegiate atmosphere of Patrick bringing this quote up, which is very nice and sort of looking for happenstantial, I suppose, or it's synchronistic. That's what I was looking for. So basically, where this comes from. So Tolkien wrote two very important essays that sort of bookended a lot of his most important creative work. The first was on fairy stories, which is that essay he delivered originally as a lecture in 1939 when he was mid-40s, I think 47 years old when he gave that lecture. And then after that, he wrote The Lord of the Rings. It was basically, that lecture was delivered between The Hobbit's publication and most of The Lord of the Rings' composition, and a lot of the more mature sort of evolution of his primary mythology. So between on fairy stories, where he sort of laid out his theory on fairy stories and on Faërie as the domain of enchantment, it was sort of his manifesto for the craft. He then used that as a jumping board, as sort of starting point for then to engage in some of the most important literary work that he completed and that was completed in the 20th century, if not human history. I'm a little biased, but it's legitimate. But then at the end of his life, when he was in his mid-70s, he wrote another essay, which is an essay based on a story called Smith of Wootton Major. This is the last fictional work that he composed in his lifetime, complete story that he composed in his lifetime. It is a proper fairy story, fits the bill quite perfectly. It is a beautiful story. I do highly recommend it. But he published it, or he created it alongside an academic essay, which treats the story almost historically, but it's a beautiful essay. And the final paragraph of it is, I think, the most beautiful bookend to his sort of lifetime, his decades of mythic composition. And it's one of my favorite bits of writing from him. So I want to just read that in full. And this packs a punch. He says, Faërie represents at its weakest a breaking out, at least in mind, from the iron ring of the familiar, still more from the adamantine ring of belief that it is known, possessed, controlled, and so ultimately all that is worth being considered, a constant awareness of a world beyond those rings. More strongly, it represents love. That is, a love and respect for all things, inanimate and animate, an unpossessive love of them as other. This love will produce both ruth and delight. Things seen in its light will be respected, and they will also appear delightful, beautiful, wonderful, even glorious. Faërie might be said indeed to represent imagination, without definition, because taking in all the definitions of this word, aesthetic, exploratory, and receptive, and artistic, inventive, dynamic, subcreative. This compound of awareness of a limitless world outside our domestic parish, a love in ruth and admiration for the things in it, and a desire for wonder, marvels, both perceived and conceived. This Faërie is as necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human as is sunlight for physical life.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And the smith, is he called Wayland?
No, but there is the Smith Wayland, who did also make his way into a very early form of Tolkien's mythology, where he was actually Feanor the Smith. But Wayland, Tolkien had gone to Wayland's smithy many times, and he was certainly inspired by the story of Wayland as this, other than human sort of blacksmith. But Smith in this case is Smith Smithson, that is his. He's a cook. Sorry. Smith specifically, he eats a star, which allows him to enter the domain of Faërie, and he visits there many times throughout his life and adventures in Faërie. But it's about a cook and Smith. It's a fascinating story. I do highly recommend reading.
Okay. The only reason I asked was because the first story in Wild Folk is about Wayland.
The Wayland story is fascinating because it has traditions or it has versions in many traditions. There's an Old Norse tradition, and there appears to be an Old English tradition. And we have Wayland's smithy in, I think it's technically in Oxfordshire, but it's the very bottom of Oxfordshire. And it's a fascinating story connected with him. Tolkien did come up with an Elvish name, Volunder. No, that's the Norse. I forgot what his Elvish version was, but he tried to work that into his mythology, and then it took on a life of its own and became Feanor, the crafter of the Silmarils, who's sort of the guy that ruined everything for everyone.
Well, but thank you so much for reading that beautiful quote, and it is, yes, as vital as sunlight. Can't have anything more important than that. Thank you so much. And Olivia, over to you.
Thank you, Izzy. Thank you so much, Erik. This has been amazing. Such an informative and inspiring talk, as was the last one. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Our next Living One speaker will be 2 weeks from today, on Friday, September 26th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We will be joined by Philip Carr-Gomm to tell us about Awakening the Song of the Soul. Next week, 1 week from today, will be our midway course gathering for all of our course participants. And if you're here today or watching at home and you're not yet registered for our companion course for this series, you're still welcome to join us. You can register and learn more on our website, krulos.org, or reach out to Izzy and I or anyone with questions or interest. We would love to see you next week. But for those of you who won't be joining us at the course gathering, we'll see you 2 weeks from today. And now, before we wrap up, I'd like to introduce you to another one of our lovely Grace Village residents. This is Sebastian. He is a sulcata tortoise around 15 or 16 years old. He was relinquished about 8 years ago and is 80 pounds. He's an extraordinary person, extremely social and emotionally intelligent. He's very warm and loving. And he's unlike our other Grace Village tortoises because he actually does not brumate. So he doesn't sleep in the colder months as many of the other tortoises do. He's up and around all year round. He likes to be outside, taking walks in the field, but he's also well set up indoors for when it's a little too cold for him to be out in the fields enjoying the sun in the warmer months. He's a wonderful person, and we just wanted to introduce you to him today because all of your support and your continued engagement in our work supports Sebastian and all of our other Grace Village residents. So thank you, everybody, for being with us today and for joining us for all our Living One talks and speakers. It's been wonderful to be with all of you. And Erik, thank you so much for your time and everything you shared with us today. It's great to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you either next week or in 2 weeks.
Bye.